And we can expect that in 40 years' time there'll be twice as many, at least, houses to house the additional multiplying population as there are today. So I hope that many of you civil engineers are into housing. That's where the future, the immediate future lies. In spite of the fact that in Mozambique, just, 100 kilometers or so away to the east of us here, the mortality rate is, the infant mortality rate is 60%. In other words, of every 10 babies born, 6 of them are going to die in infancy. And there are a total of something like 40,000 young children who die of starvation in the third world every day. But we live in the developed world. We have learned how to split the atom and how to make the atomic bomb. We have flown to the moon. And we're busy taking a look at other planets. I love the expression on this little duck's face as this rocket ship takes off to go to visit the moon. And we've even been able to photograph the backside of the moon, which we've never seen from the Earth, but from orbiting satellites we've been able to take photographs, and we've learned how to generate electricity. Yeah. And as the world population increases, so the combustion of coal and oil by industries and cars increases, pumping ever-increasing volumes of sulfur and nitrous oxides and hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Yes, what we are busy doing, we human beings, is reversing what the algae took all of those billions of years to do for us when they created an oxygenated atmosphere out of the carbon dioxide atmosphere. We are reversing that process, and we are pumping back carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. And the resulting sulfuric acid rain from the oxidation of pyrite, you know, this fool's gold, the iron pyrite that you get together with the coal, and when that burns, it produces sulfuric acid. And this sulfuric acid comes down as acid rain, and it is destroying forests and aquatic life at a devastating rate in the northern hemisphere. I'll speak a little bit later about what it's doing in the southern hemisphere. But let's stay in the northern hemisphere for a moment, because if we look at the Parthenon, 2,400 years old, but it's only in the last 24 years or less that the wonderful Grecian friezes at the Parthenon have become the victims of sulfuric acid attack to the marble. You see, the marble is calcium carbonate, and that reacts with hydrochloric acid to produce calcium sulfate, which is gypsum, and which spalls off. And so these Grecian friezes, these at the Parthenon that have been there for all of those years, are just very recently starting to decompose. And there has been more corrosion in the last 24 years than in the previous 24 centuries. It's no wonder this old chap is looking so concerned about it. And if we look at the Taj Mahal, I've never looked at it myself, but my son was there the year before last, and I told him to please take particular notice of the fact that the marble coating of this wonderful monumental building is being attacked by carbon dioxide to produce gypsum, which is spalling off. And indeed, this is what is happening there. Chartres Cathedral, this is the rose window in the northern transept, and as a result of sulfuric acid attack, I would have been ashamed to show you the southern transept because the imagery is no longer identifiable. In the northern transept, at least, you can still see some of that imagery. I visited Santiago some years ago to give a course of lectures there, and as I was approaching by air the city of Santiago in Chile, I was appalled to see the amount of atmospheric pollution. I could see the Andes there in the distance, the snow-capped Andes, but I had been living in the city of Santiago for 7 days before there was a heavy downpour of rain, and when I got up in the morning for the first time after arriving in Santiago, I could actually see the Andes in the distance because the rain had cleared the polluted atmosphere. The pollution is something else. There are tens of thousands of minibuses that stream into that city every morning, burning diesel and exuding carbon dioxide and other toxic fumes to such an extent that the atmosphere in that city has become a difficult one to breathe. I went to pay my respects to the South African ambassador, to General von der Westhuizen, and I took this photograph from the window of his 20-story building in the center of the city, and he was quick to point out to me that if I looked very carefully, I could see the top of the Andes there in the distance. And then he coughed and he said, "Oeh, magtig." Professor Brink, ek wil nou so baie graag huis toe kom, Suid-Afrika toe, om die lekker suiwer lug van Suid-Afrika weer in te asem. And I said, "No, ja, General, that's okay. As long as you don't live anywhere near Sasolburg, or for that matter, anywhere on the eastern Transvaal Highveld, where with drag lines we are pulling coal out of the ground, coal that took millions of years to form in our biosphere. We're pulling it out, and I've checked this figure last week. At the 4 Secunda mines alone, we're pulling out 45 million tons of coal per annum for the production of fuel. And from the Eskom mines, we're pulling out 80 million tons of coal per annum from the coal deposits that took those millions of years to deposit. And if we look at what is being done with much of that coal, it is being used in the Eastern Transvaal Highveld power stations to generate electricity. 125 million tons of pollutants are released into the atmosphere every year from these Eskom power stations. And if we look at the result of this, if we look at the Sabi Graskop exotic forest, for example, which I believe is the second largest exotic forest in the world, we see that the trees there, the pine trees, have for some years shown signs of severe distress, probably directly attributable to air badly polluted by sulfuric acid, or possibly from tropospheric ozone, either of which are thought to be high enough to cause chlorosis, this yellow blight that you see on these pine needles. And according to information that I received from the CSIR just yesterday, it is not yet known whether this disease, this chlorosis, is caused by the effluent from the power stations or whether it is from the tropospheric ozone. Either way, it is the result of man's interference with the atmosphere. And we go on generating power from these thermal power stations when just to the north of us we have these wonderful unexploited hydroelectric sources, hydro sources on this continent, much of it within economic reach of South Africa. To quote the late Professor Desmond Midgley, he has stated, "It is indeed a sobering thought that the energy equivalent of what Eskom will be generating in 30 years' time in coal-fired power stations that unavoidably pollute the atmosphere and consume non-renewable resources has for ages past been dissipating itself in turbulence in the big African rivers of the north on their way to the sea." All right. A hydroelectric power station near the mouth of the river Zaire would be, let me not get into that controversy tonight. This is a map, a world map of carbon dioxide emission. The red areas, I took this out of National Geographic magazine. The red areas are areas where there is more than 100 million tons of carbon dioxide pollution per annum. And although countries in the northern hemisphere, you see, are the main contributors to the global greenhouse, we in the south will suffer most from it. By the year 2050, we can expect a global rise in temperature of between 3 and 6 degrees Celsius, with decreased availability of moisture to plants by possibly as much as 18%, and sea level rising at a rate of 2 centimeters per annum. Now, even a 1 meter rise in sea level could devastate low-lying countries, which could render millions of people homeless in the not too distant future as a result of the melting of the Antarctic sea ice. Not to mention what this does to the inhabitants of the Antarctic, and not to mention, because I won't go into the effect of chlorofluorocarbons, the so-called CFCs, creating holes in the ozone layer as the chlorine in the lower stratosphere dissolves the ozone. This is a eucalypt forest, and why trees are so important to us human beings is because the trees are the planet's lungs. The trees and the ocean together are the lungs of the planet, and we need to have organisms like trees to convert this carbon dioxide that we are creating back into oxygen by absorbing the carbon with photosynthesis. And thank goodness we've still got part of our Tsitsikama forest left. Not very much of it, I'm afraid. We've still got our fever tree forest in the Kruger National Park, and we've still got parts of the Costa Rica rainforest and of the Borneo rainforest. Because these forests are so important, there are so many layers of life in a rainforest. This is a picture I took out of National Geographic some years ago, and you see all the different layers of life in a tropical rainforest. You see the elephant down here, and going right up through all of these different species, this is their habitat. But what are we doing to these rainforests? Well, in Kenya, we're cutting them down for firewood, so that this is what much of the rainforest in Kenya looks like today. 1/3 of Malaysia's rainforest is now under cultivation of oil palms. I was very distressed when I was there last year, or was it the year before? I can't remember. Each year, 11 million hectares of tropical rainforest are destroyed. Here in Malaysia for the planting of oil palms, but elsewhere for other purposes. And rainforests throughout the world are being destroyed at the rate of about 1 football field in size per second, day and night. And more than 1,000 biotic species are disappearing as a result each year. This is a Landsat image taken from a satellite, taken in 1973 over Rondonia in the western Amazon rainforest. And in this sort of satellite image, the chlorophyll in the trees, in the vegetation, shows up red. So what you see is red on that image, you must imagine to be tropical rainforest. Apart from this wretched yellow line that you see here, running across from east to west, which is the road that was built by the World Bank in order to try and retrieve the loan that they had made to the farmers in Rondonia.